It's a strange meeting, this get-together of the three outsiders from beyond the Chaos Dome and the priest who has in the past dozen years ministered to a congregation of rotting, shambling corpses. And yet, despite how rusty initially Edmund, the priest of Thorvath, is, and it takes a while to get a true conversation flowing, eventually an exchange takes place with some level of comfort in these early hours of the night of what passes for the pre-dawn under this unnatural and light-consuming barrier that merely changes times of day by letting a little bit of an orange hue seep into the otherwise pitch blackness. Edmund, of course, has many questions, and so do our three intrepid explorers. And in due time they find that they can satisfy each other's curiosity to some extent. Edmund naturally being very keen to understand how it is now that there are people and people from outside that were able to penetrate, finally, the barrier dome. A fact, incidentally, where it comes to light that the passage of time for Edmund is exceedingly hard to track, and he is not quite aware of how long it has been, how many years, and perhaps with the flow of time potentially being convoluted, it might have flown differently outside than on the inside. At the mention of the stranger with the prism for a heart, he pauses and with this reaction stirs some hope in Murdoch, Quinn and Nellike that he might actually know something about who the stranger is. But alas, he knows nothing and merely reacts to yet another confounding element of a picture that for the last decade or more he has not quite managed to make sense of. Quinn naturally accosts Edmund with questions about what happened and how did the dome come to be and what was it like in those early days of the shattering here, but Edmund naturally has merely been on the fringes here and along for the ride more than anything, and he does not know who brought this on them except for the suspicion, of course, that everybody shares that it has something to do with King Alaric and his 12 most loyal valiants. And it's in this context that the name Orin first comes up, and that Edmund describes this fall from grace of at least one of the valiants that he is aware of, and how shortly after the shattering, Orin would still come here to this chapel, to this crypta, where his sister is buried. His sister who was taken too soon by a sudden illness brought on by very mysterious circumstances around which rumor flies and tales are woven of descent between two valiants, Orin and one of his compatriots who, through some foul action, brought the sickness to bear on Orin's sibling. "Oh yes, in the early days he still came," says Edmund. "But he grew increasingly paranoid as the years went on." He pauses and his eyes unfocus as he looks back on a painful memory. "The last time he came, he was barely human, and even though he always charged and complimented me with standing vigil over his sister, he..." And he pauses and touches his broken face, enough of a correlation for Quinn, Murdoch and Nellike to put two and two together. "Whatever it is that he is now, he is no longer human." And it's this final verdict of Edmund that sends the wheels spinning in Quinn's mind, who is, out of the three, the one the most charged with understanding, of course, the metaphysical aspect of what happened to Old Wyndham. And he mutters to himself as he scribbles notes and conjectures something about the influence of chaos and whatever it is that happened to order and balance, and how suppression of two of the universe's fundamental powers always leads to eventual collapse. But enough of this talk. Come now, you must be tired. Rest up, I have ample space in my chapel. And with that, Edmund opens the door to one of the side rooms and beckons our party of 3 to make camp. Hello friends, Anderson here. Welcome back to EVENNIGHT, the 3rd installment, which potentially is again 2 installments, we'll see, with a second full week's worth of 7 rooms to flesh out and partly at least play through. It is still the first of Shiga, Moondark, the decline of EVENNIGHT, transition into the first day of the year, and that itself poses a bit of a problem. Because if we remember the mechanical stipulations that I put on myself that I'd like to integrate here, I really wanted to work a little bit with the moon phases and with the passage of time in here and perhaps find a way to integrate. But for that to happen, we also need to build in some ways to pass the time. And that's what I've been thinking about for the last week or so, and where Edmund provides us with a wonderful chance to both implement a side quest that is related yet optional for our main pursuit in here, which is the eventual confrontation with Orin on the next Moondark, but also the potential to spend some time, to pass some time. And that is where I latched onto the elements that we've already rolled up for Orin, which is that an honored warrior had brought a foul sickness onto his sibling. And I figured, well, we have a crypta here, it's a chapel, it's the town that Orin was in charge of even in life, and that potentially he is originally from. And so, if the sibling has been afflicted by a sickness, naturally we can assume that this sickness was fatal, and that the burial place is here, in the crypta. How does that help us pass time? Well, the way it could have gone is that initially, after the shattering, Orin still came here, and whatever was behind the Chaos Dome and what Alaric did, I don't think it warped the 12 Valiants immediately, instantly. It will have subverted them over time, the same way it would have subverted the king over time, possibly. And so in the first years, Orin still came here, still paid his respects even to Edmund, the priest, still visited his sister's grave. Why a sister? Yeah, 1 to 3. But that as the chaos influence, the influence of the moon seed or the fake moon seed or whatever Alaric was doing to his followers festered, and Orin warped and became something more akin to a berserk or sacrifice apostle. I think in his last visit here, on the cusp of really shedding the last of his humanity, he flew into a rage and broke Edmund's face, and at the same time also rampaged through the crypt and collapsed the main access tunnel down there. And with the aspect of time and moon phases in mind, I think we can also pick up on something here that has us build in the conceit that for the pantheons of this world, the moon is considered the mother of the gods. Because I initially also wanted something that made the moon tied into the forces of order, which in this case the deities of the pantheon somewhat represent, even though in and of themselves they also represent aspect of chaos, balance and order, which is the natural order of things. And so the full moon has some religious semblance, the same way that the Moondark has some religious semblance. The prayer type is different, but the full moon is like the peak of the religious calendar month. And so Orin always came on the day of the full moon here to pay his respects to his sibling, because fearful naturally of grave robbers and of tomb robbers and things like that, and just generally out of a sense of tradition, which I assume this is something that the noble families, due to tomb robbers and grave robbers and such, have always done. The crypt of Orin's sister is only accessible on the day of the full moon. There is a moon door, a magical moon door that is set in with a little moon shaft leading up to the surface, and only on days of the full moon, when the light hits the door and a dial set in a door registers the moonlight, it opens up and lets a person in. So that is for us a potential time passer for anyone, also not only our party, in this dungeon, to have a use out of this month's time to resolve this level, which means free up the tunnel that Orin collapsed in his rage, to make it to the moon door, and then enter into the crypt of Orin's sister. And, well, why would we do that? Because Edmund, on that last visit, noticed that Orin brought something there. He had something with him. Edmund isn't quite sure what, but Orin was very clandestine about it, very circumspect, and when he came back he didn't have it with him anymore. So we know here now that we have our area boss who brought something down into the crypt of his family member that also means a great deal to him, kind of the last vestige of his humanity, and left it there, destroyed the access to it, collapsed the whole tunnel, beat up the priest, and never came back. And with that, I think we have kind of a side/part of the main quest that would allow us to plant a device there, a narrative device in that crypt. We'll flesh out the details of what it is, that will have a bearing on the fight with Orin, so that will maybe negate one of his abilities through whatever it is that he buried there. But to get there, we have to clear out the tunnel, and we have to wait until the moon stands highest in the sky, so at least about 2 weeks. So it's quite fortunate that we have a host here who has some spare rooms, A42, A43, to help us settle in, make a camp, and start digging. Which also kind of answers the question of what is in A42 and 43. One is where Orin stays, where he has his hideout, or his, well, he's not exactly hiding, actually, more of his retreat, his personal room. And I think the other room is simply a neglected space, the former sacristy, where back when he still had others to join him in the ceremonies, he would formally apply his war paint to his god of strength and get his robes donned by his helpers, but he's now all alone. He does all of that in his own chamber that he's retreating to, and so this other room just collects dust and cobwebs and everything. So let's make A42 our former sacristy, and this is where now, with the help of Edmund, our 3 can set up shop. So we'll have some makeshift bedrolls here that they put up. But even though we decide what kind of a room it is, I think we can still give some religious dressing here. Thanks to Scrapperlock, by the way, for reminding me that I do in fact have tables for religious design. It's OSRIC, the AD&D 1 retro clone, so it has this appendix from AD&D for dungeon building, and does have a D100 religious table. So let's roll on this 3 times and scatter around a little bit of appropriate dressing. And as the 3 enter, they find a room that has been long neglected and barely entered. Dust is thick on the ground, and a rickety lectern, fairly beat up and clearly no longer in use, stands discarded off in one corner, perhaps in the past having been rolled out for special sermons on special feast days that no longer exist. and behind it a trunk full of vestments that were also reserved for these special holidays that have just not been taken out of their spot of storage for the last decade plus. The only thing that still seems to see a bit of use, as evidenced by the line of footprints in the dust going back and forth between the door and this shelf, is a wooden storage shelf full of stacks of wax candles that Edmund has used rather sparingly over the last years, but he's still got about a third of his stores left before he runs out. "Well, here's home," says Murdoch as he unrolls his bedroll in a corner. Nelica simply does the deed without any comment, whereas Quinn is, well, what could charitably be described as airing his grievances about the lack of amenities, but would more realistically just be described as whining. Let's do the same exercise for Edmund's room. So this is Edmund's room. We assume Edmund also sleeps on a cot, and he's probably got a bit of furniture, but let's also here roll ourselves up 3 items from this reference table and find out what is there in terms of dressing. Edmund's chamber is rather sparingly furnished. He's got an old wardrobe that he stores his meager belongings in. He's dotted his room with some candlesticks to make some light. He's got a small table with a few stools around it, a rug in the center to tie the room together a bit, and an incense burner at the foot of his cot. The only really eye-catching centerpiece is a large bronze gong worked in with the iconography and some religious motifs of the Thorvath religion of strength, because this is one of the main expressions of this religion. On the highest feast days, they just bang the gong really, really loudly because strength and everything. And that brings us to the main focus of today's building and overall episode, which is the crypta. And the way I'm currently envisioning this is we have a room A44, which is the entrance to the crypta, that immediately leads to this collapsed area where a long stretch of tunnel is just caved in through whatever powers Orin unleashed. And then beyond that, we have various rooms to explore, for which I'll probably use some geomorphs from the campaign notebook, because it's nice and tidy to just have some dungeon rooms to drop in here. But we also already know that our final room, our destination here, will be the moon door that we cannot quite open yet, but that we will be able to return to and pass some time and come back to when the full moon is up. And I've been thinking about how to handle the passage of time here, and also how to make this dungeon eventually work for a group that isn't just my group running through it and doing this in a kind of a solo fashion. And I think what we need for this is sort of a cumulative challenge where each attempt consumes a certain amount of hours, and where at most 2 members of the party can work. So we bottleneck the capacity a little bit because we have limited space. And in our case, I don't think Quinn is much of a digger. I think Quinn will be studying the chaos hole in the wall upstairs, while the other 2 are busying themselves trying to make some progress here. So the way I'd like to gamify the passage of time here a bit and make it a effort reflection of what the players do, and also give them kind of a choice to make here. I want to handle this like a kind of a extended challenge where a number of die roll successes are required to be accumulated. And right now, from even night, from 1st of Shiga until full moon, I'd say we have about 15 days. And what I want to do is I want to make a system where it takes 10 successes cumulatively, with 2 players only being able to roll in each segment, and each segment consumes 4 hours. and it can only be attempted at most twice a day, at least by the same people. So unless we have a really large party, realistically speaking, at most we get a couple of rolls a day in. And if it is attempted twice a day, so if 2 4-hour chunks are spent on this, for the second a constitution check is required, and if it's failed, then the next day is a full day of rest requirement, unless the character wants to incur a disadvantage on strength rolls. And if we then make that require 10 successes, we can at least assume that we probably spend around a week or so to clear this out. All things, of course, depending on the composition of the party and how good their constitution is, because this will be a constitution check challenge. And of course, you can also think of additional implications here that will facilitate, like if you run this as a separate mega dungeon, separate from my party, what I would like to add here also is mechanics for, initially there aren't really any tools, so they need to be found somewhere in the location here. I'm sure we can distribute them somewhere, and without tools you can't even get started, or maybe you only have then half the progress and you can only roll once a day. And of course, with every day that passes, you need to also take into account rations, you need to forage around and try to find a way to survive. All of these things would have to be taken into account, or would potentially serve as complications to work around with. So you could have a flow where a party works on this for a few hours and then has to go out foraging. You could seed some random encounters in the area here, like, not to mention that not every one of the building ruins that we have here that we don't flesh out can't just be a randomly generated location, so you can just kind of roll up something. All of which is to say, by putting this here, this is kind of a nice tool to facilitate a GM sort of moving time along inside the dungeon here, while at the same time presenting some incentives to always go out but also work towards the goal here, because there is some incentive as well to pursue whatever it is that Orin wanted hidden here, because generally if the big area boss wants to hide something, the party will be interested in finding out what it is. Due to time constraints, I will be simplifying this somewhat, so I will be assuming that we have rations enough and that Edmund can also provide, possibly his congregation occasionally brings him some food, because that's also a habit they had in the past. So all we really need to do is roll a bunch of times to find out how much time passes in our game until our party is able to break on through to the other side. 8th of Shiga, first quarter moon. Nellike wipes the sweat from her brow and drops another chunk of rock, an activity she has repeated uncountable times in the past week. During that week, Murdoch and her have spent hours down here in this tunnel, trying to, as noiselessly as possible, remove stone after stone, fighting against masses of dirt and earth sliding through the cracks in the broken walls, propping up their progress, and occasionally discussing whether this even makes sense to do, and whether they can fully trust the priest upstairs, Edmund, who has admittedly not given them much of a reason to doubt his words. Honestly think he's only lied to us once, and that's when he said he has every faith in us to remove this dome. Nellike laughs harshly. Him and me both. That's the spirit, says Murdoch. Wait, do you feel that? And they both pause in their ruminations, and Nellike, going through the motions, having just dropped a rock again, bends down, and there is an unmistakable draft coming from the other side of the collapse. Immediately the two of them quicken their pace and tear at the mounds of rubble before they catch themselves and start bringing in more lumber, more reclaimed wood to shore up the progress they've made so far. But before long, they have, after a week, finally made it through. Well, there's a relief. Perhaps we can go and find a horrible death there now. I don't think I'll survive another night of Quinn elaborating on his latest theory about the Chaos Dome. And with that, they both recede upstairs. That was like 11 segments of rolls, with some more successful than others, and occasionally weaving in a day where I did 2, but overall just assuming as well some foraging time for them and some time where they spend kind of scouting around and going through empty ruins and houses, which we don't really need to zoom in narratively, all at the same time while Quinn is kind of messing around with trying to figure out theories about chaos domes and the nature of chaos and stuff like that. So we've passed some time. We're about a week away now from full moon, which would open the door to our last chamber here that we will have to build. And I think, all things considered, that puts us in a fairly good position, because we also need to account potentially for some full rests if we run into trouble here and take some damage. Mission accomplished, I would say. The cave-in of Orin did the job, which means we can actually start generating 2 rooms that are at the ends of our corridor fork here. This is done using 2 die 8, 1 die 8 determining the horizontal orientation, which will roll the black one for, and the vertical, which will roll the red one for. 27 leading us to a chamber with a secret door. I think that's sort of the shape we're looking for, and there is a secret door there off to the side. Let's see if there's immediately a connection point for that secret door to just tie into by rolling up the adjacent one. 4 and a 2. Okay, this extends more into a corridor, so let's make it so. But then of course the corridor probably needs some interesting features, some traps or something worthwhile to look at, maybe a lore drop or whatever else the discovery die determines that we have here. Maybe nothing. Would be nice if there was something though. This is plopping down a random empty corridor isn't all that exciting. But let's start with a 4-5 and give it a little bit of dressing. I have some random tables here. I think I have items in a royal tomb here, which is sort of the general drift, I would say, even if we are a few social strata below. So I'm just gonna roll 3 times on that table, and then we'll see what we get to work with. As one enters this chamber with its walls slightly widening at the angles and then narrowing back down again, leading one towards a lectern in the back that upon it has a dusty, heavy old tome which lists the genealogy of the family whose crypta this is. Orin's family, presumably. The centerpiece is undoubtedly the plateau that follows in shape the outline of this chamber, and slightly elevated has planted on it a large amount of burial urns, relatively simple yet respectful in design, and judging by the number, there's about 20 of them. This would almost suggest that there are here buried, laid to rest, not the immediate closest members of this family, whose crest also hangs as a reminder above it all, mounted to the wall on an ancient shield. But perhaps these are special considerations for loyal retainers over the years who find their resting place somewhat off to the side, like in life, but still within the confines of the place of honor in this family crypt. Interesting, so maybe the genealogy records can also be a bit of a clue still. I'm just picturing this from a perspective of a group of characters that doesn't interact with Edmund maybe, or even attacks him. So there would be potentially a way to find a clue about Orin, a way to plant some information about Orin and his sister. So this genealogy record, while it's maybe a bit useless for our party, in different circumstances might be a nice loophole to submit some information that you would otherwise be hard-pressed to place. And now what I'm thinking in relation to the secret door and A46, this corridor here, I think what we could do from like a dungeon design perspective, if I picture entering this here, there is a part of this that immediately has a purpose, and there's another part of it that just looks relatively empty, and thus it's perhaps also somewhat easy to spot a potential trap or something like that, or at least to suspect that this might be trapped. And I think this should be the case, and I think we should also roll for a certain trap design here. But what, again, from the perspective of through the eyes of a player entering here, I would like to do is make this empty enough to give one pause and perhaps pursue here, and have this secret door be present as a way to just lead into a secluded chamber that in fact contains a mechanism that can disarm these traps. So we have a purpose for the secret door, we have kind of a signaling approach for this long empty corridor that also suggests itself as a place to be cautious of, and we have a little bit of a reward for exploration which allows one to bypass a danger. So I think that's what I would like to do. But of course we also still have our dungeon die to roll for our previous room, which gives us nothing, but since it already gave us a secret door, I think that's also more than enough. Let's maybe go a bit old school with the traps. Let's draw from the original reference material from old Dungeons & Dragons and roll a percentage die here. 91 stairs fold flat into a sliding chute. So that would actually make this kind of interesting. So we have a level change here still. So this is one level down and these are stairs. And I guess what we could have here is kind of like a deep pit that is covered up until the trap is sprung, and then if one steps onto these stairs without first disarming the mechanism, which only then the family members would know, or perhaps like the loyal retainer that has to go and do this while the family dignifiedly walks there. That could work, I think. So definitely now makes it a bit harder to spot as a trap the fact that there are now stairs there, but I'm sure that anyone who's been dungeon crawling has enough paranoia to think this is a bit straightforward. I think maybe in terms of just like random dressing, we'll also suggest like sort of an archway here, like a symbol of Shiga maybe, since that's our goddess of the rebirth here. I don't think this is exclusively dedicated to Torvast, it's just a chapel, but the burial rites will very likely be in the hands of all the gods. And to have here like a more modest, undecorated arch, just to hit home again this differentiation of the status. And I do like the level change that we go even deeper. Maybe we can even kind of make this tomb, depending on how the dice favor our layout, sort of descend almost like in a kind of spiraling fashion, with the tomb of the moon door all the way at the bottom. We'll see. For now, maybe a little bit of dressing here from our royal tomb, but not too much. Let's roll up 2 items. And as one walks under the arch of Shiga towards the descent into the afterlife that this tomb layout suggests in its architecture, there are small alcoves carved into the wall, just large enough to host a decorative suit of armor, very uniformly made. There are 6 of them lined into the wall, and were one to open up the fronts of the closed helmet, perhaps one would be in for a bit of a shock, because within, contained in the suits of armor, are the mummified remains of soldiers. Well, that took a turn. I rolled up the armor suits, and then I rolled up the mummified remains of soldiers, so I figured to stick them in the armor suits. Are they gonna come to life? I mean, I guess we'll ask the dungeon die. Do we have potential hostile encounter here? 7. As a matter of fact, we do. So we do have a little bit of a left behind by dear old Orin, who has, through his newfound powers imbued by him in his new form of whatever he's turned into, reanimated these formerly inanimate and actually buried here loyal household soldiers who will now come to life if anybody not of the right blood walks down these steps, provided they manage to turn them into steps and not into a slip and slide beforehand. So now this is both trapped and there is an encounter here. That should make it a fun one. Let's generate ourselves another room. This is 6 and 7. I guess we'll just be completely straightforward. There is a pit at the center, and given where we are here, and given that the suits of mummified soldiers are out there, perhaps this is also kind of a burial ground where the pit is actually filled with soil, and at the bottom of the pit there are the remains of more loyal retainers. Like, this whole level is sort of the various degrees of appreciation for those not immediately of the family, and this is the track that leads towards the family, hence it's protected by the more military retainers in the afterlife. And hence it's regarded as more important than the side where there's maybe the seneschals and the retainers that are less of a protective and more of a useful kind of nature. And I've just noticed that this is like a earthen-filled pit where the bottom is more buried soldiers. Let's do a bit more tomb dressing. I think here also 2 will be enough. And so for those who make it past the slip and slidey stairs and into the pit room, there is eye-catchingly off to one wall a large stone slab engraved with names and deeds of those that are buried in the pit, and inside the pit itself, on top of this earthen burial mound down there, strewn are some 50-odd silver pieces. This is more of a ritualistic advance payment for the protective services they render in the afterlife. And what I completely forgot to do was figure out how to open this secret door, so we will roll on the unusual mechanisms table in the Tome of Adventure Design. We will roll 3 percentage dice and figure out how to open this thing. And that gives us to rotate the blue stone clockwise of the idol 3 times. So there has to be an idol. I guess to match some symmetry, we'll put a little pedestal here with an idol. Idol of, let's make it Shiga with blue stone 4 eyes, one of which can be rotated, and then pointing to the secret door, rotate 3 times to open. That's actually kind of neat, because rotating it once then does nothing, and it might cause the hasty player to give up. This is a 4-7. Anything on the dungeon die here? Nothing. Okay, so we can continue with our next level here, and I would say we'll just have that be another descent. I don't think that one counts as a room, that's just a staircase, so we'll pick up where this connects again. So we have the stairs coming down here, and this is the family level of the crypta, so anything here now is no longer retainers. Let's work out a shape for the next room. 5 and 2. Oh, interesting. So that's an interesting design. I think I'll modify it slightly and make it a bit bigger. But what we have is, so this may be a bit confusing perspective because I'm not good at stuff, but basically what I'm picturing is like a room that has a fairly deep drop, about like 2 levels down, and it goes another level up, and the walls are completely filled with niches that are just enough size to put a casket in, so that the family burials are always happening in one of these niches. So the casket is put in there and it's like a whole just large vault with several levels of these niches filled with caskets as a means to bury these ancestors of Orin. And of course this makes me think that at the end of this is our moon door, and then up here is our shaft that then goes all the way up to the surface level. It kind of bypasses. That's why the design also winds around it a little bit. And yeah, there's some stairs here to descend down into the lower levels, and presumably like some tastefully hidden ladders to access the higher levels. I'm assuming if they do like a burial here, they put up like a scaffolding or something. Well, not that they're doing them anymore, but in the past they probably did this. So this is like the main show. And I feel like this moon door locked chamber was perhaps in the past not actually a burial site. It's just out of his sentimentality for his dead sibling that Orin kind of decided, my sister doesn't go into a hole in the wall. She deserves only the best, and I shall be the only one who has access to this. Now, A4-8 is here. I think this deserves a bit more dressing, so we're rolling 3 times. And following the descent into this imposing multi-story chamber with its elevated walkway leading up towards this moon door that is fairly striking as a unique magical artifact placed down here in the crypt of this fairly obscure family. The standout features are perhaps the 4 stone caskets resting on the deepest level of this chamber, stood on the marble floor, and assuming a sort of special place of honors, as this is perhaps the burial place of the founders of this family line, for whom this was initially made and then added to over the years. The burial concept revised, no doubt, over the generations until this multi-storied wall-interred casket concept was put in place. And outside of those features, the only thing that really catches the eye is a lectern placed right at the center with the family's ornate prayer book placed on top of it, and standing in front of it, the rigid yet upright form of a corpse-like figure, both palms resting next to the prayer book, back turned to the descending stairs, and unseeing eyes fixed on the moon door. And I think that's a pretty good cut-off point here, so we will leave off here. We will pick it up in the next video on Thursday. Thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you then, and bye for now.